welcome to my guide of cycling climbs on the Côte d'Azur. From coastal cruising to resplendent alpine ascents, it's easy to see why the Riviera is a hotspot for top-level pros. I've been fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time in the area over the last few years, and no matter how many times I ride these climbs, it simply never gets old. It's an immensely rewarding place to cycle, regardless of whether you're smashing out efforts or just enjoying the ride. The criteria I've adhered to for climb inclusion is that they all fall within a reasonable riding distance of Nice and Monaco, and that they're generally hills that the average person would enjoy, meaning no weirdly steep, half-unpaved abomination of roads. Well, for the most part. The content is a jumble of footage from 2020 through to today, which I've spliced together to hopefully give you an idea of what to expect. I've tried to summarise each clip in just a minute or two, but there's obviously quite a lot, so I've added chapters to enable you to jump around more easily. I've also linked all relevant segments and information in the description. Here we go. First up is Col d'Az, as this is the nearest major climb that you can tackle straight out of Nice. There are various roads that you can take from the coast which will eventually merge into the same route, but this is the main segment which they used in the second stage of the 2020 Tour de France. It's 10k at 5%, and the first few kilometres are a bit busy and messy as you leave the urban surroundings of Nice behind. This first straight bit is actually one of the steepest sections, but you'll probably be fueled by adrenaline from all the potential traffic manoeuvring. But it's not long until you're overlooking the city and get a few moments of respite on some flatter sections. After about 3 kilometres, the road changes direction, which isn't altogether noticeable as you're riding it, and with that comes quite a significant flat section, although somehow it always feels like a headwind when I've ridden it. When it kicks up again, you're just over halfway, and this is where the other routes up start to join in. On the right there you have the Corniche for Chemin, which can be climbed from Beaulieu or Villefranche-sur-Mer, and also Chemin de Vinaigrière, which is quite a steep one and starts down in Villefranche. You also have the option to peel off up Mount Louise here, which is a quiet lane that runs alongside this main route of Col d'Az. The rest of this climb is much more scenic than the first half, as it's running parallel to the sea and you have sweeping views to your right. The last few kilometres flatten off a lot, but keep pushing until you reach the official summit, which is by the unmissable bike sculpture. The whole climb is very well signed with kilometre markers, a nice benefit of its frequent use in races. And I can't talk about this road without giving a shout out to one of my all-time favourite spots, Fort de la Rivière. So if you take this left, it's about a 200 metre climb up to the fort. It's a dead-end road, but it's a really nice spot to ride up to and soak up the views. And on a clear day, you can even see Corsica. It's really hard for me to ride past here without veering off on a detour up to it, but yeah, just a really nice extension. And the main route continues to roll along all the way to La Turbie, where you can head inland or descend down to Menton. And along the way, there's lots more roads that drop down to the coast. It only makes sense to include perhaps the most famous Riviera climb next on this list, Col de Madone. There are a few different ways to ride the opening kilometres, but the most famous segment, which is widely regarded as the KOM segment, starts after the various routes converge, which is actually at about 250 metres above sea level. If you're riding from the coast, the Col de Serra de la Madone is probably the most pleasant route. The turnoff is a little easy to miss, but you climb away from the busyness of Menton really quickly. Another popular route is straight up the D22 and past the Intermarche, and then you can also approach it from the west from Gorbio. The start of the proper climb, where you might want to start your stopwatch, isn't very obvious, as you're actually already climbing when you hit it, but it's shortly before you pass under the A8 by this green gate on the left. The climb from here is about 10 kilometres at 7%, and it can be split into 2 pretty distinctive halves. It's quite straightforward up to St Agnes along a decently wide and smooth road with just a few tight bends, and you'll start to get some good views of the Mediterranean. As you approach St Agnes, the road flattens off and you have to take a hard turn left, sort of back on yourself. It's a bit easy to miss this if it's your first time riding it. And from here the landscape of the road changes noticeably. The second half actually has a slightly easier average gradient, but it's quite difficult to get into a rhythm because it's not very consistent. There are a few bits where you're dipping into the double digits, but there's also quite a long flat section, although it's hard to drill it along here because it's pretty narrow and the road is bumpy, along with a few dark tunnels. There's usually some rocks to dodge as well. I've done this climb before without seeing a soul, but on weekends and holidays you might encounter masses of cyclists. But it can be super peaceful up here and you just feel a world away from everything, which is a stark contrast to where you started the climb just a few kilometers earlier. Unless of course there's a practice event for rally cars going on. The summit always takes longer to materialise than I expect, but you know you've made it when you pass this incongruous sculpture on the right. It's a classic, and for good reason I think. It's probably not everyone's cup of tea, but it's quite unique and an essential if you're in the area. If you continue on over the top, you'll descend about 240 metres to a sort of ridge road. If you go left, it's a very slight downhill for about 10k, all the way to Lantosque, which is a town that overlooks Monaco. There's lots of shops and things here, and it serves as a popular meeting point for cyclists. And if you go right, you'll reach the perched commune of Peille, which is the summit of yet another climb. Alright, so this will be a quick one, mainly because it's not my favourite climb ever. It's an interesting one because there's loads of tight bends, but it doesn't exactly have that sweeping, majestic alpine feel to it. It starts down in Col de Peille by a big quarry, and you're hit with the hardest section straight away. The climb in its entirety is 6.5 kilometers at around 7%. There's actually a slight downhill section just a few minutes in, and then it hovers at around 8 to 9% for a little bit. This hill is frequently used in Paris-Nice, and I'm envious of their ability to use the full width of the road. The frequency of switchbacks increases while the gradient gradually eases off throughout the climb. While it might not be an all-time favourite, it's still a brilliant climb and a great gateway to hills further inland. If you're doing a loop from the coast, you're likely to descend this road on the way out, then climb it on the way back. So it can also be a bit of a challenge if you have a lot of fatigue in the legs. You'll know you're near the top when you pass a car park and start to enter Peille itself, and you can pick up even more speed around these last few bends. If you continue along, you're on that road which leads all the way to Lantosque, and you get some pretty awesome views of the village and valley as you slice through the mountain. Time for my favourite, Turini! It's one of the highest climbs in the region at a little over 1600 metres, and there are 3 main routes up it, from Sospel, L'Escurenne and Lantosque. They're all vastly different, and I really wouldn't be able to choose a favourite. The ascent from Lantosque is the one that's been used most often in races such as Paris-Nice and the Tour de France, but it's the furthest to get to if you're approaching from the coast. And so for me, personally, it's the one I've ridden the least. In terms of climb profile, it's the most straightforward of the 3, 15 kilometres at 7.3% for an elevation gain of just under 1100 metres. The gradient is fairly consistent, although the opening kilometres are marginally milder, and it flattens off as you pass through La Bolène Vesubie. This section's a little confusing as you have to take a circuitous route through the village due to a one-way system which isn't entirely obvious, especially as lots of the Strava segments are modelled on the race routes which just chop through the centre. The rest of the climb is very straightforward, but there are a few steeper sections towards the end which always start to bite. You do get some really stunning views, but they're easy to miss when climbing since they're all kind of behind you. Stage 20 of the 2024 Tour de France climbs Turini from Sospel before descending down this road to Lantosque, and this is also the route that is being used for the Étape du Tour. It's also quite well known for being the site of the Monte Carlo rally. Lantosque itself has a few shops suitable for stocking up on fuel, along with some public toilets. And in cooler months, you can expect it to be warmer on the climb than down below in the valley, which gets somewhat frigid as the road is cloaked in shade from the surrounding mountains and draws in dampness from the Vesubie River. I've never ridden much along the valley road, the M2565, which is the main route up here. It's not terribly busy, but it's not the kind of road I find pleasant to ride along. I'm sure for lots of people it'll be fine, especially with a group. It's of course very dependent on where you're starting your ride, but there are other nearby hills that would take you off the main road that you can incorporate into your route if you're willing to chuck in a whole lot more climbing.
Come on.
The climb up Turini from L'Escurenne is the most substantial in terms of both distance and elevation gain, but it also has the shallowest average gradient. So it's 4.8% for 26 kilometers for just over 1,300 meters of vertical ascent. Lantosque itself is a great starting point. It's also the base of Col de Braus, which will appear later in this video. There's a great boulangerie on the corner, which is often overflowing with cyclists. Highly recommend a stop there. So the first 6 or so kilometers is a bit of a drag. Still a lovely road to cycle along, but despite climbing nearly 300 meters, it feels like a bit of a false flat, which is kind of augmented by the road signs that indicate the distance to the summit. It can be a bit dismaying to see 25k to go when you're travelling at 10 miles an hour and already breathing hard. Once you pass through Lucéram and bear to the right, you'll embark on what is one of my favourite stretches of road in the whole world. This section's about 10 kilometers at 7%, and a little halfway through begins a truly epic succession of switchbacks. You can also reach this bit of road from a lane that peels off at the top of Braus. Obviously you've been climbing for quite a while at this point, so the hairpins break it up really nicely and provide some relief, at least from a psychological perspective. Regardless of whether I'm dribbling through an effort or struggling at the end of a long ride, I've never failed to appreciate the splendour of this section of road. As it tends to be exposed to the sun, it's quite an enjoyable descent as well. After the hairpins, you start to head further inland under the shelter of trees, and the gradient drops off drastically. The road passes through the small village of Paracava, which has a few shops, but I'm not sure I'd rely on them to be open. The final 10k roll along at an average of a gentle 2.4%, which is kind of nice, but it also feels as though it goes on forever. It's very undulating, but there's this one wall where it kicks back up, and I'm always convinced I have a puncture. There's not much in the way of views aside from the occasional glimpse through the trees, and it can get quite chilly. I always lose track of where I am on this climb, as there's lots of little micro descents, but after a bit more squiggling around, the top of the climb kind of pops out of nowhere. So the ascent from Lantosque, while the longest, is also the most variable, and it's quite easy to split it up into pretty defined sections. There are also a few opportunities to deviate from the main route. Instead of bearing right at Lucéram, you can go left and climb up Col Saint-Roch, which eventually loops back around to just before Paracava. The final side of Turini starts in Sospel. This was actually the first side I ever climbed. Sospel is another great base, just watch out for the opening hours of the bakeries, as a few of them tend to shut for extended hours at lunchtime. The other side of Braus can also be climbed from here. There's a train line that cuts through the mountain and connects it to Lantosque. And not too dissimilar from the Lantosque ascent, this one is 24 kilometers at 5%, and it basically gets increasingly more difficult throughout the 1,210 meters of climbing. The first 8 kilometers are quite gentle with a few dips, and you'll be forgiven for questioning whether you've actually started the climb, but it soon settles into a more consistent rhythm and you can see the climb zigzagging up the mountain ahead of you. This rear camera footage was from February, so it's relatively barren. This was an unusually warm period, so I seized the opportunity to get up the mountain, but there can be a fair amount of snowfall in winter. In the summer, the hillside is overflowing with vegetation. Shortly after you pass the Notre Dame de la Menor, the gradient levels out and you get a few relatively flat kilometers as you approach the commune of Montee. After this, things gradually get tougher, but also more consistent, with the last 10 kilometers averaging about 6.5%. Continuing with the theme of the other two ascents, the last few kilometers really drag on with no distinguishing features to break things up. This video is from the last time I did an effort up the whole climb, and I started to really struggle in the last 20 minutes or so, but it's another really special climb and one of my all-time favourites. It's also suitable for just rolling up and enjoying, as the gradients never get too severe. At the top there are a few hotels with restaurants, get some of that blue roux pie, and there's also a bonus loop you can ride. This road climbs up to the Cap d'Argent ski resort, and you can continue on to this viewpoint, which marks the start of this one-way circuit. It's about 10 kilometers and passes some old fort and tank ruins. The road surface is a bit bumpy and there are some fairly steep kickers on the return leg, and the air might start to feel a little thin as you're up above 2,000 meters. But it's definitely worth doing if the weather's nice, as you get some epic panoramic views. Next up is the aforementioned Col de Braus, which can be climbed from either Lantosque or Sospel. The more famous side is the Lantosque ascent, which is the one being ridden in this year's Tour de France, and it's just under 10k at 6.5%. The road starts to gently ramp up after you peel off right, and the first few kilometres are pretty featureless, bar a small village and a few hairpin bends. Then at around 3k there's a slight dip in the road and you can pick up some speed. The Cascade de Braus is to the right here, and you get some good views both behind and above you. From here you turn further inland, and just after 6 kilometres you hit the famous section of switchbacks. They're really tightly packed and it's actually pretty hard to stay on the correct side of the road, but they're great fun and you get a real sense of just how high you've climbed. Shortly after the hairpins there's a short steep section which always catches me slightly by surprise, but once you've conquered this it's a fairly steady 2 kilometres to the summit as you wind further inland. This road on the right here is the one that joins the hairpins as you climb Turini from Lucerne. This side of Braus is south facing, so if it's a sunny day you can expect it to get pretty toasty on this climb. But the descent into Sospel is much more sheltered and the temperatures can drop pretty quickly if you carry on over the top. There's a restaurant at the summit which I've heard lots of good things about, although I'm not sure I've ever seen it open. And alongside a monument to René Vietto, there's a little bike station with a pump and some tools that has recently been added. Braus from Sospel is less popular but a fantastic climb in its own right. At 5.7% for 11 kilometres, it's not hugely dissimilar from the Lantosque ascent but has a very different feel. The first 3 kilometres are uncomplicated as the road snakes upwards, then you hit a section of lacets. If you're as bad at cornering as me, it might involve a bit of freewheeling and braking around these corners. A road joins in on the left which cuts through to the top of Col de Castillon, which I'll touch on briefly next. There's a slightly flatter section before it kicks back up to the steeper section of the climb, which briefly dips in and out of the double digits for a few minutes. There are some military forts and ruins scattered around, and you might see the famous Braus goats or patu sitting in the road. After a few tight bends, there's just one more dig to the summit. And we're back. So the road I mentioned that peels off halfway up Braus joins the top of Col de Castillon after about 6 rolling kilometres. From there you can either go left and descend into Sospel, or you can go right through the tunnel and head back to the coast. If you're staying in Mentone, close to the Italian border, this is the most direct route to get to the mountains further inland like Turini. There's a few different options here. The most straightforward route is just heading up the D2566, and that's about 11 kilometres at 5%. The beginning's a little busy, but it gets nice and quiet pretty quickly. There's also a slightly longer, but in my opinion more enjoyable route you can take, which climbs from Mentone to the Perch village of Castella, then drops back down to the main road. It obviously adds a bit of extra elevation as well, but it cuts out the busiest section and it's quite a nice climb, about 5.5% for 5k. And after it joins the main road, there's about 400 metres of climbing left to the summit. Before passing through the commune of Castillon, you'll pass the Caramel Viaduct, which is the remnants of a tram line which used to link Mentone to Sospel. Then a few kilometres before the top, the road splits in two and you'll bear to the right. The road that branches off left descends straight into Sospel through a tunnel, but you're not allowed to cycle along it. But it's not far to the top, and from there you can either cut through to Braus or descend down. The remaining climbs aren't necessarily staples in my regular riding spots, but they're pretty special and well worth a trip. Okay, this one isn't that special, but it's a decent little climb and makes frequent appearances in pro races, and it's also a good connector road. Starting from Côte, Col de Châteauneuf is about 6.5 kilometres at 6.5%. Côte has plenty of shops and public toilets, and the Boulangerie Lefebvre has some very nice pastries and a coffee machine. The climb starts by a roundabout just after you cross the river and pass a theatre, and it actually shares a few similarities with the Peille climb, firstly being that the steeper section comes at the beginning. It's still never too difficult, maybe briefly 8 to 10%, but it's easy to overdo it here. Then after about 1.5 kilometres you hit a sequence of switchbacks. They're quite tight and a bit difficult to carry momentum through, and you definitely have to watch out for cars swinging around on the wrong side of the road. This road here leads to Madone, which climbs up to Col Saint-Roch, and I'll talk about that one next. There are a few easier sections as you approach the village of Châteauneuf, and once you reach it, you'll know that the bulk of the climb is behind you. This last kilometre is quite straight, and there's a little flat section before the final drag up to the summit, where there are medieval ruins. The other side of the climb is very gentle and drops down to Tourette-les-Vans, where you can access some rolling roads, and it's also a good way of getting to Mont Chauve, which is coming up soon. I briefly mentioned Col Saint-Roch, or Saint-Roch, in the Turini section of this video, as it can be climbed from Lucerne, but the southerly ascent can also be reached from Côte or from Madone, which you can join from a road that branches off halfway up Châteauneuf. It's a 5k climb of about 300 metres elevation gain to Croaky, and then the road pitches up and down for a few kilometres before settling back at 7.5% for 5.5 kilometres up to Col de Sospel and then over to Col Saint-Roch. I really love this section of road. It's usually super quiet and peaceful, and you can see the road towering above you, which, while a bit daunting, is really satisfying as the amount you've ascended is almost tangible. Descending down right will take you to Lucerne. If you go left, you'll be descending Col de Port, which takes you to the foot of the Lantosque side of Turini. Then if you go straight, the road actually keeps climbing for another few miles until you join the top of the switchback section from the Lantosque ascent of Turini. So loads of options there, and they're all pretty great. Now we're going to hop across west to the valley road that leads to Lantosque, where there is an out and back climb up to La Madone de Hotel. You can also get to this climb from a balcony road that goes through Louvain. The turn off to this climb is over a narrow bridge, and then you swing round right, and there are public toilets just up the road if you continue straight for 50 metres or so. Hotel is a very gentle and steady climb, but quite long, about 5.5% for 15 kilometres. The start is very unassuming, not a particularly exciting road, but it's not long before you start getting awesome views of the valley and mountains in the distance. The village of Hotel is just over halfway through, and then that road opens up and passes by some shops. You might also see a few dogs here, which gave me a heart attack the last time I descended this climb. But I think they're friendly, maybe? This road leads to La Tour and joins up with the other valley that eventually takes you to Isla and beyond. From here the road narrows and takes on a more rugged feel, but it's actually a really nice shift and the variation makes the climb fly by. I've only actually ridden this climb twice as it's a bit out the way. The first time was a baking hot summer's day, about 35 degrees, and there was a bit of traffic about, but on this day in February it was pretty much deserted, which is not surprising given that the climb doesn't actually lead anywhere. There are some really brilliant views as you dip in and out of the trees, but the real treat lies at the summit. When you swing around the final bend and past the chapel, the road plateaus and you get panoramic views. As with most areas around here, it's steeped in history from the 18th century and beyond. You can catch glimpses of the chapel from all over the hills of the area. Another such landmark is the aerial top Mont Vial. I've only ridden Vial once as it's a bit of a backcountry trek, but if you're in search of that on top of the world feeling, it's another great out and back climb to conquer. There's a few different ways to approach it, but be prepared for the last 5 or 6 kilometres, which average around 9%. Another dead-end climb culminating in spectacular 360-degree views is Mont Chauve, or Bald Mountain. This one is easy to access as it lies just a few miles north of Nice, The short version of this climb is 5k at about 8%, but the top section adds a further 120 metres of climbing, as we'll see. The first kilometre is nothing to shout about, but you can see the lone peak of Chauve looming above you. Then after about 2 kilometres, you start zigzagging back and forth. It's unlikely you'll see many vehicles, at least you better hope not because it's quite narrow. You're more likely to see mountain bikers and hikers than other road cyclists. The gradient is fairly consistent, then at 5 kilometres you pass this parking area and have to go through a gate. The road gets pretty bumpy and gravelly from here, and it's a bit steeper with quite tight bends, but it's not far until you abruptly reach the top, which is marked by telecom masts and the fort. You can see Nice sprawling below you, and it's pretty cool that you can do a relatively short climb and get away from the city so quickly, especially as it's such a quiet bit of road. It's also a great climb to do in winter as it's south-facing, so the slopes are generally bathed in sunlight. Col de Vence is another winter classic as it's very open and exposed, which is a lovely treat in cool months, but probably unforgiving in hot or windy conditions. Vence itself can be quite busy. A lot of famous artists are associated with it, so you'll probably pass features like the Matisse Chapel en route. There's also a fountain at the base of the climb which you can use to fill up your bottles. Apparently Vence is actually famous for its spring water, so it's probably good stuff. The start of the climb has some traffic calming obstacles to contend with, but it all drops away quickly to give way to barren slopes, with certainly very little in the way of tree cover. It's another fairly long and steady climb at 6.5% for 10 kilometres. There aren't many super defining features, but the kilometres are well signed, and as you change directions a few times you start to get some great views over the Mediterranean. The 70.3 Ironman Nice comes up here, and it also seems to be popular with pros for intervals, presumably because the consistent gradients and open surroundings make it a very straightforward climb. Conversely, there's a cluster of outrageously steep climbs to be found near the bottom of the Route de Grace. I'm not sure I'd actually recommend these because they're a bit excessive, but if you're looking to spice it up, then Route des Costes, Route de Care, and Chemin des Cormets pose a risible Triple C challenge. If you continue straight over the top of Vence, you'll hit the Plateau de Saint-Barnaby, and from there you can descend towards Carros and the River Var, or continue further inland where there are many more open roads and steady climbs. Just to briefly touch on riding around Monaco, even if you don't intend to go into it, you'll probably find yourself along this coastal road at some point. The stretch between Nice and Monaco isn't too crazy, but I basically tried to head uphill as soon as possible. There are lots of climbs that peel off this road and head up towards Aise. The Moyenne Corniche is the main road, which can be a bit busy, especially just above Cap d'Aille. But if you continue on up to this top road, you can get to Col de Aise or La Turbie. From the coast to La Turbie, it's about a 400-metre ascent. In my opinion, the nicest way up is this road from St. Laurent. The Route de La Turbie is also a good one, but I'd recommend taking this shortcut, which is narrow and steep, but beats the busy main road. Then you've got a few options above Beausoleil. This one is being used in this year's Tour de France final stage time trial. Once up by La Turbie, there are a few viewpoints. The Tête de Chat is very popular, but my favourite is up by the Monte Carlo Golf Club. If you climb all the way up, it's about 3 kilometres at 8% and provides some fantastic views of Monaco. As tempting as these hairpins look, unfortunately you can't ride up them. This whole top area is occupied by the Nice airbase, and there's signs saying you might be at risk of getting shot. And as much as I love climbing, I must say I've never felt tempted in the slightest. But you can still enjoy this great stretch of road, which also seems to be a favourite of pros. And we are done. I must say that this proved to be a much larger undertaking than initially anticipated, but I'm glad to have a comprehensive collection of my favourite hills on the Côte d'Azur, and hopefully it hasn't been too outrageously tedious to sit through. If there are any climbs you think I've missed out or that you'd recommend, please let me know, because I'm always looking to explore more. Thanks for watching. We made it.